The Royal Navy had been the supreme naval power of the world at the start of the 20th century for nearly the past 100 years, when Admiral Nelson defeated the combined French and Spanish forces at Trafalgar. They had led the world in warship design and development, and anyone who dared try and surpass them either quantitatively or qualitatively was met head-on by the long wealth of seafaring tradition and experience Britain had. Britain and her empire's survival depended upon her fleet and its control of the sea. The British people and their government understood this, and after the Naval Defence Act of 1889, the two-power standard governed Royal Navy construction, dictating that Britain was to have a navy at all times larger than the next two biggest ones combined. This policy had been created to try to ensure Britain would stay above the French and Russian navies, but even as they prepared to fight the last century's wars again, a young maverick emperor of a country that had only existed for not even 2 decades had dreams of the sea and of ships. Kaiser Wilhelm II was the grandson of one of Britain's greatest monarchs, Queen Victoria. He deeply loved his grandmother, and was always fascinated with her fleet of beautiful and powerful battleships. Yet as he grew older, this passion turned to jealousy, as he recognized Britain's navy was the backbone of her empire, and if Germany wanted to become a great power the way Britain had, she must go to sea. Wilhelm's dreams were vindicated by a book published by an American captain, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who argued that securing the waves guaranteed protection and interdiction of commerce, and that if a nation wanted to be the most powerful in the world, they must obtain this maritime control. The Kaiser made Mahan's book the Bible of his burgeoning navy, and began pushing the Reichstag for greater expansion of the German fleet. This was met by the German politicians with a steadfast response. Germany's Prussian tradition was one of the soldier and the horse, not of the sailor and the ship. Her traditional enemies were on land, and the country possessed so small a coastline that they argued only a coastal defense force was needed. Recognizing he would need someone with tremendous leadership and persuasion to win over the wary people, the Kaiser went looking for his Mahan. He found him in Alfred Tirpitz. Tirpitz was a career officer who had joined the Navy at age 16, but only after a friend announced he was doing so. He came from a relatively well-to-do family, the son of a lawyer and later judge. He had initially been mediocre in school, but fit right in what was then the Prussian Navy. Because of her daughter's marriage to Frederick III, the Prussians had a good relationship with the British. Tirpitz spent much of his early career at bases like Plymouth, which he himself reported was more comfortable than Kiel. These early years gave Tirpitz a great deal of experience with the British, something that would pay dividends in years to come. As Tirpitz worked his way up the ladder, he began to work increasingly with the Kaiser, and was finally offered the position of Secretary of the Imperial Navy when the former holder of the post stepped down after the Reichstag slashed his proposed naval budget. Shortly after accepting, Tirpitz presented the Kaiser with a memorandum describing his future plan for the Navy. This was revolutionary, as it planned to grow the Navy to a set goal, as opposed to prior efforts which simply expanded the Navy here and there when needed. The memorandum highlighted Britain as the enemy, and stated that even though Germany may not be able to outbuild the British, the expansion of her fleet would require the British to concentrate a stronger force in her own backyard of the North Sea, and thus increase the vulnerability of her sea lanes. Additionally, this threat would frighten the British, who would be reluctant to engage the Germans for fear of losing the majority of their fleet and subsequently being unable to sustain their empire. The Kaiser was overjoyed with Tirpitz's proposal and wholeheartedly backed him. The German admiral then brilliantly used his political skills to gather support for his plan, visiting statesmen like Bismarck, the King of Saxony, the Prince Regent of Bavaria, the Grand Duke of Baden and Oldenburg, and the councils of the Hanseatic towns. With one grand endorsement after the other, Tirpitz then turned to the people to pressure the Reichstag. Newspapers published articles about the disparity between Germany and the other navies of the world. Professors held massive lectures on the importance of securing Germany's maritime trade. Tirpitz even created the Naval League, a special interest group that promoted the expansion of the German Navy. This proved wildly successful, as the League saw membership rise from 78,000 in 1898 to 600,000 in 1901, amassing more than 1.1 million members by the start of the First World War. Tirpitz's efforts were duly rewarded. His naval bill passed, and he was subsequently elevated to Prussian nobility in 1900, becoming Alfred von Tirpitz. Over the next few years, Tirpitz would pass more naval bills much to the Kaiser's joy, but when the British debuted the Dreadnought, the German leadership was thrown into disarray. The Kaiser lamented with frustration that his ships were now useless. Tirpitz, however, saw a golden opportunity. Recognizing that Dreadnought had made not only the entire German fleet obsolete, but also Britain's own collection of now useless pre-dreadnoughts, the balance of power had been reset, and Germany was only one ship behind the British. Tirpitz swiftly set about designing a response to the Dreadnought using the existing designs for the Deutschland class as his groundwork. The German ships were built very secretly, on slipways enclosed, in effort to hide their latest creation from British intelligence. What emerged was something of a Frankenstein's monster. The Nassau class. The Nassau class were truly German dreadnoughts, and reflected both the ambition and lack of experience that the Germans had in regards to their navy. The Nassaus carried 12 11-inch guns in a controversial hexagonal layout that added significant weight to the overall design for only an 8-gun broadside. The 11-inch gun had been the German weapon of choice for the past several classes of battleships, but was outranged by the British 12-inch gun and was not as effective. They carried both a secondary and tertiary battery, ignoring the lesson from Dreadnought that a variety of mixed lighter guns was not a good idea. This consisted of 12 5.9-inch guns and 16 13.5-inch guns. 6 17.7-inch submerged torpedo tubes completed the armament. Their armor was slightly better in some areas than HMS Dreadnought, but slightly worse in others. By far the biggest mistake of the class was the continuation of using the old triple expansion engine rather than the new steam turbine. This produced a ship with a top speed of only 20 knots, slower than the Dreadnought, and compounded by the fact that the ship had a very tight turning circle radius that brought her speed down by up to 70% at hard rudder. Her weight and wide stature meant she was poorer in seakeeping and had a tendency to roll heavily. This oftentimes meant that some of the smaller caliber guns were inoperable in any kind of sea from wash, again proving their worthlessness. The roll keels the class was fitted with also helped cause the speed loss, which occurred when the ship turned. Nevertheless, they were still dreadnoughts, and for a newcomer to naval power reflected better entries in design than some of the vessels produced out of France in previous years. 4 ships were built: Nassau, Westphalen, Rhineland, and Posen. All joined the first battle squadron of the High Seas Fleet upon entry into service. They had normal careers prior to the war, and took part in many fleet games and flag-showing exercises. They were in Norway in 1914 when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and were swiftly brought back to the German waters when war became apparent. The Nassau class took part in most High Seas Fleet operations during the early stages of the war, acting as part of the supporting element for the German battlecruisers on their raids of the English coast. However, in 1915, the first battle squadron was then dispatched to the Baltic to challenge Russian forces in the Gulf of Riga, the defeat of which would enable the German army to capture the city. Apart from some minor action with the old Russian battleship Slava, the operation was inconclusive, and the first battle squadron shortly returned to the rest of the High Seas Fleet. They would then join the entire German fleet at the Battle of Jutland, forming the center of the German line of battle. This resulted in the ships having plenty of opportunities to shoot at their opposite British numbers, but when both sides broke contact later in the day, it would not be the last of the action the Nassau class would see. That night, Nassau rammed the British destroyer HMS Spitfire and tried to fire her forward guns on her, but could not as their angle could not be depressed enough to hit the tiny ship, although the blast destroyed Spitfire's bridge. Simultaneously, Posen ran into the German light cruiser Elbing, so badly damaging the latter that her captain opted to scuttle the ship rather than risk capture. Later, Nassau and Thuringen came upon the British armoured cruiser HMS Black Prince, and the hopelessly outgunned ship was obliterated by German fire from 4 capital ships, leaving no survivors. All ships in the class received only light damage at Jutland, and were shortly ready for action. They then took part in the inconclusive action of August 1916, and would later be sent to suppress Russian forces and support the Finns in a revolution against the Tsar in 1917. While in this area, Rhineland ran aground so badly that it took several months to refloat her, by which time so much damage had been done that she never saw service again, ending her days as a barrack ship. The remaining Nassaus had quiet careers, and remained in Germany when the majority of the High Seas Fleet sailed to Scapa Flow for internment following the end of the war. After the Treaty of Versailles, they were awarded as war prizes to Britain and Japan, and were swiftly sold for scrap. marking the end of the first dreadnoughts built to challenge the Royal Navy.
Thank you so much for watching. If you have a suggestion for a future video, please leave it in the comments below.